On a damp November morning in 1878, a courtroom in London filled with the scent of wet wool, damp tobacco, and quiet mockery. On trial was not a murderer, a thief, or a treasonous lord. On trial was a splash of yellow paint on a dark canvas. The most formidable art critic in the British Empire had written that the painter had asked 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. The painter, a dandy with a white lock in his dark hair, decided to sue for £1,000. It was a legal battle that would bankrupt a genius, humiliate the establishment, and permanently alter how the world looked at a picture. To understand the courtroom drama, we must first understand the provocation. The year was 1877, and the Grosvenor Gallery had just opened its doors on New Bond Street. It was intended as an aristocratic alternative to the stuffy, conservative Royal Academy. Among the canvases on display was James McNeill Whistler's ** Nocturne in black and gold, the Falling Rocket *. It depicted a nocturnal firework display over the Thames at Cremorne Pleasure Gardens. To the Victorian eye, accustomed to narrative paintings loaded with moral instruction, historical battles, and photographic precision, Whistler's canvas looked less like a finished work and more like a careless blur of dark tones with spatters of chrome yellow. It was a canvas painted in shorthand. The public blinked. The critics sharpened their pens. But one critic possessed a pen tipped in vitriol that could curdle milk. John Ruskin, the undisputed emperor of Victorian art criticism, toured the gallery, stopped before Whistler's rocket, and published a review that crossed the line from aesthetic disagreement into professional assassination. Ruskin wrote that he had never expected to hear a coxcomb ask 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. In the currency of the late 19th century, 200 guineas was a small fortune. But more than the money, Ruskin's review questioned Whistler's sanity, his integrity, and his right to call himself an artist. The two men at the center of this impending storm were absolute opposites, locked in a collision course of class, philosophy, and ego. John Ruskin was 60 years old, a towering cultural prophet who had taught a generation how to see beauty in Gothic architecture and Alpine stone. He believed art was deeply moral, tied to truth, nature, and the spiritual elevation of society. To Ruskin, a painting required patient labor, faithful representation, and intellectual substance. If you charged a high price for a canvas executed in a matter of days, you were committing commercial fraud against the public. Across the metaphorical aisle stood Whistler. Born in Massachusetts, trained in Paris, and settled in London, Whistler was a professional eccentric. He wore extravagant suits, sported a monocle, cultivated a dramatic white lock in his dark curls, and weaponized a razor-sharp wit. He did not believe art had any moral duty whatsoever. To Whistler, art was about arrangement, harmony, tone, and mood. A painting of a nocturne was like a musical composition. It existed for the ear of the eye, not to tell a story or preach a sermon. The legend suggests Whistler was merely a sensitive, misunderstood genius. The documented fact is that he was fiercely litigious, chronically broke, and thoroughly obsessed with his own social standing. When Ruskin published his attack, Whistler did not write a letter to the editor. He consulted a solicitor. He demanded £1,000 for libel. When the case of Whistler v. Ruskin opened before Baron Huddleston in November 1878, the courtroom turned into high society theatre. The press packed the benches. The spectators included artists, critics, and society bluebloods who had come to watch the circus. John Ruskin himself did not attend. He was too frail, suffering from the mental and physical exhaustion that would soon cloud his final years. He was represented instead by a formidable legal team led by the Attorney General, Sir John Holker. Whistler arrived impeccably dressed, carrying a cane, radiating supreme confidence. The trial quickly descended into a surreal debate over the definition of art itself. The defense cross-examined Whistler ruthlessly, trying to prove that his paintings were slapdash pretension. They brought out the Falling Rocket and placed it on a chair in the middle of the courtroom. The Attorney General asked Whistler how long it had taken him to knock off the painting. Whistler's response became instantly legendary. He replied that it took him perhaps 2 days, 1 day for the composition and another for the finish. 2 days' labor for 200 guineas, the Attorney General scoffed. Whistler leaned forward and delivered the killer line. "No, I ask it for the knowledge I have gained in the work of a lifetime." The courtroom buzzed. It was a brilliant rhetorical defense of the artist's autonomy. But as the trial progressed, the testimony revealed the chaotic reality behind Whistler's bohemian confidence. His finances were a disaster, his studio was drowning in debt, and his prices were largely speculative. If Whistler was the star of his own performance, the witnesses called to testify provided a Greek chorus of Victorian anxiety. The defense trotted out respected royal academicians and painters of historical battle scenes to stare at Whistler's canvas and pronounce it an offense to human vision. They pointed to the lack of drawing, the absence of finished detail, the murky depths of the paint. They argued that any competent art student could produce such a thing in an afternoon. Whistler countered by calling fellow artists and supporters, though many mainstream painters balked at backing him publicly, terrified of social ostracization. The legal arguments wobbled between high philosophy and playground ridicule. The defense treated the canvas upside down at one point, trying to prove that it had no coherent top or bottom. The judge, Baron Huddleston, struggled visibly to grasp the concepts being debated. To the judicial mind of 1878, a painting was a commodity of time and materials. If you bought a chair, you expected 4 sturdy legs. If you bought a painting, you expected a recognizable landscape or portrait, rendered with painstaking anatomical precision. Whistler's argument that a painting was an atmospheric harmony of color felt to the court like an emperor's new clothes routine. Yet, beneath the comedy of errors, the trial exposed a profound cultural fault line. The old guard of moralizing academic realism was fighting a desperate rearguard action against the dawn of modern abstraction. On the second day of the trial, the jury reached a verdict. It was a masterpiece of Solomon-like compromise that satisfied neither side and ruined the victor. The jury found in favor of Whistler, agreeing that Ruskin's review constituted actionable libel, but they awarded the artist damages in the amount of 1 single farthing, the lowest copper coin in British currency, worth 1/4 of a penny. Legally, Whistler had won his point. A critic could not publicly accuse an artist of fraud without consequences. Practically, the verdict was a humiliation. A farthing in damages meant that the judge ordered both sides to pay their own legal costs. For Ruskin, whose wealthy friends and admirers quickly formed a subscription fund to pay his legal bills, the cost was a minor inconvenience. For James McNeill Whistler, the legal fees were catastrophic. The cost of mounting the trial, paying witnesses and settling court expenses totaled several £1,000s, a staggering sum that he simply did not possess. Within months of his courtroom triumph, the bailiffs arrived at the White House, Whistler's newly built home in Chelsea. His prized collections of blue and white porcelain, his expensive furniture, his Japanese screens, and his paintings were seized and catalogued for liquidation. Whistler was declared bankrupt. Bankruptcy in Victorian England was a social and financial death sentence for a gentleman. Whistler did not linger to watch his creditors pick the bones of his estate. He packed his bags and fled across the English Channel to Venice, carrying little more than his brushes, copper plates, and a burning grudge. Venice, with its decaying palazzos and shimmering water reflections, became his refuge and his redemption. Commissioned to create a series of etchings, he spent over a year working feverishly in the alleyways and canals, producing some of the finest printmaking of the 19th century. When he returned to London later, he was chastened, hardened, and more famously eccentric than ever. He turned his bankruptcy into a badge of honor, adopting an even sharper wit and launching public lectures, most famously the 10 o'clock, in which he articulated his manifesto for art's sake with diamond-hard precision. As for Ruskin, his health declined rapidly after the trial, and his brilliant public career drew to a quiet, isolated close in his Lake District home. The irony of the 1878 trial is that while Ruskin won the cultural war of the courtroom, Whistler won the war of history. Today, John Ruskin's sweeping moral imperatives on art are studied as historical relics of Victorian earnestness, while James McNeill Whistler's shimmering, atmospheric nocturnes hang in the greatest museums in the world, valued at millions of dollars. Where did the money actually go? It vanished into the bottomless pit of 19th century legal fees, court costs, and auctioneers' commissions, leaving the victor penniless and the vanquished untouched. History is rarely fair to its pioneers, but it is often ruthlessly poetic. The transcript of Whistler v. Ruskin remains one of the most entertaining and illuminating documents in the history of culture, a moment where the 19th century collided with the 20th in a cloud of legal jargon and aesthetic fury. The documented facts are clear. Ruskin published the insult, Whistler sued, the jury awarded a farthing, and the artist went bankrupt. The legend that Whistler walked out of court a triumphant, wealthy champion of modern art is just that, a comforting myth invented by admirers who preferred their heroes unblemished by debt notices. Whistler was difficult, arrogant, and financially reckless. Ruskin was dogmatic, puritanical, and dangerously insulated by his own reputation. Yet between them, they define the terms of the modern artistic debate. When you look at an abstract painting today, or listen to an artist argue that a canvas needs no excuse other than its own existence, you are standing in the courtroom on Wall Street, watching a dandy with a monocle demand payment for the knowledge of a lifetime. Looking back across the decades, whose judgment do you trust more? The critic who demanded moral labor from every brushstroke, or the painter who priced a lifetime of vision at 200 guineas?